Hello and welcome to an emergency Arsenal Women Arsecast less than 24 hours after we recorded the last one, obviously reacting pretty instantaneously to the news that Jonas Eidevall resigned as Arsenal Women head coach. Well, the announcement was made on Tuesday morning. My understanding is very much that he met with the club on Monday and that he offered his resignation, which was accepted at that point. Jamie and I will kind of cover, I guess our response to it, maybe a little bit about the inevitability of it presently. But I just thought I'd start at the top with the actual story as we understand it. Essentially, I'd been kind of waiting for this since Sunday evening, and my understanding on Monday that there was likely to be a meeting of sorts, and when that's happening, there's one or two things that's probably going to happen. It's going to be a sacking or a resignation, either way. And on Monday evening, I didn't have firm news that Jonas Eidevall had resigned, but that very much seemed to be the way the wind was blowing. And then this morning, Tuesday morning, I had a couple of messages and became aware that he had resigned. And, just to kind of lift the curtain a little bit, I always let Arsenal know when we know something like this. And so my breaking of the story and Arsenal's statement came at the same time. That could have been a coincidence. It doesn't really matter, essentially. But yeah, we alerted Arsenal that we knew about the story this morning, and obviously they've made the statement. And the important thing is, it's out. René Sleggers will take the team likely for the next two games. Obviously, there's an international break after Sunday's game at West Ham, and there is a press conference at time of recording. We're recording at just after 11 a.m. on Tuesday morning. René will face the press this afternoon for a UEFA-mandated press conference ahead of Wednesday night's game against Vålerenga. But Jamie, we covered this on the pod yesterday. Well, actually, you kind of are a bit more emphatic on this than me about Jonas's demeanour in the press conference on Sunday and how it felt different and how it felt more vulnerable. And, you described him as sounding beaten and defeated. Any surprise over this at all?
No, Tim, I can't say I'm surprised. I don't think anyone really is. Maybe a little bit with the timing of the announcement. I think we all maybe expected something yesterday, given the fact that Vålerenga's tomorrow. However, like you said, that press conference, he was a bit of a shell of what we've seen over the last 3 seasons, a very emotional kind of pulled back version of himself where he was speaking a little bit more from the heart than from his tactic kind of dogmatic brain. So yeah, I'm unsurprised by the announcement at all, Tim.
Yes, I mean, same here. Like I said, I was kind of waiting for this after Sunday. I do think that perhaps everyone kind of before Sunday wanted to get through to the international break before this. But I mean, obviously, to be honest, Vålerenga, with all the respect in the world, Arsenal really should be able to take care of that game. West Ham away is not a great hunting ground for Arsenal, but I do think it comes to a stage where once you've got like a dead man walking and everyone knows it, you've kind of just got to do it. And I guess in terms of how Arsenal have started the season, I mean, it does look a little bit like, and this is like speculation, not information, but I don't know about you, Jamie, particularly for me, over the last week, things changed. So I was told over the summer that he was told, things have to improve in terms of the WSL and the Champions League in no uncertain terms. And I've hinted at that on the pod a few times, and I don't think that's a remarkable statement. That's exactly what Arsenal should expect. But I don't know. I just got the feeling, not of any sort of downing of tools. We talked about this on Sunday. It looked like the players were still fighting, but I think you could see the connection was gone, couldn't you?
Yeah, dramatically, Tim. I think there's been a big shift in not only performances in the last week, but like you said, it's the demeanour of the whole team in the club. It seemed a bit disconnected. It feels as if after the final whistle on Saturday in that Chelsea game, he got everyone in for the team huddle, and then Jonas always goes around with the team to clap the fans, and he walks straight down the race and into the dressing room. So I think you kind of got a sense of that, and I often really like watching the team and the manager after a defeat, especially, and seeing those kind of that body language and how the players react. And Jonas is always the first one to lead the team around in a lap. So I think that was a big indication of the fact that there's probably a bit of a discrepancy. And now we've obviously seen that. But I just think in the last week, Tim, like you said, like it's been a difference. Arsenal, obviously on paper, it's the first time that Chelsea defeat is the first time Arsenal have lost 3 times at home in the WSL for 10 years, which is a massive thing. So on paper, in terms of performances, there's been a shift. But like you said, Tim, there has been a big mentality shift. And I even thought that in his press conference last week ahead of the Chelsea game. I thought he was a little bit more maybe reserved and on guard with his answers. He's usually very quite sure of himself and sure of what his message is. So yeah, I think the signs really aligned for what was going to happen today.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, I guess, like, it would be worth, given that we've been in a lot of his press conferences and, experienced him in the flesh, as it were, quite worth covering that angle. I've always wanted to be careful about doing that while he was in situ because, frankly enough, people accuse me of softballing him and stuff like that, which, fair enough, whatever. But I think now he's gone, it's probably possibly a more appropriate time to talk about that. But I think you're right. He's like sure of himself. And, I don't think either of us, well, I can't speak for you, like, don't mean that pejoratively, but there's always been a confidence, I think, in his communication, always incredibly rational and head on. And I've kind of been talking to a lot of people on Twitter over the last week, kind of saying, look, it might be gone on the pitch, but like comments wise, post match, I've pretty much never come out of his any of his press conferences thinking, what was he talking about there? Like, I think he's always been like fair and quite measured. And I think you're right, is that something changed there in the last week. But I guess from before we go into like the fan and the football reaction and what went wrong and everything, what's like your kind of impression of him? I guess as a journalist and speaking to him and asking him questions on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think to be honest, like Arsenal bias and everything aside, as a journalist, I really, really enjoy attending Jonas Eidevall's press conferences. I think he's very responsive to journalists in a way that managers across the WSL aren't always consistently. I think you can catch him on a bad day and you see that in their press conferences. Whereas I feel like Jonas is very like, he knows that it's almost a part of his job to address the press. And I think he does that with a mutual respect and he really analyzes the game. And Tim, I've honestly, like, to speak a little bit more personally, like I've learned a lot from your interactions with Jonas and I've brought that into the way I interact with other managers. Because if you ask him a really analytical question, he's actually interested and he's very interested in being able to speak that through with you. And you both have these sort of interactions where you can delve it a bit deeper. So as a journalist, I've found it very interesting to speak to Jonas. I think he's always willing to kind of draw back the curtain and really give you a bit of an insight in what he's thinking and what the team's thinking. And he's not often one to give short answers unless it's on injury news, which he is quite reserved for. I think he's quite responsive in that way. And I've always respected that about him as a journalist because I don't think all managers do express that. That's just my take on how he's been from an outsider's perspective in someone that's just a journalist and not a fan of the team.
Yeah. Like I've never seen him like bite anyone's head off or anything in a post-match presser. And I even saw Joe Montemuro do that a couple of times. And Joe's like one of the nicest people you can meet. But I guess a criticism people have often offered in the Arseblog news kind of comments section, some of the nicer criticisms, it must be said. And let's be clear, a comments section is not necessarily a place where you have to be like super rational or analytical. That's what comments sections are there for the emotional reaction as much as anything. But something I kind of agreed with over time, a lot of people kind of said like, and I feel like this, like I really respect his tactical brain. And I really think that's why Arsenal were good in big games under him, where there was lots of tactical tweaks, lots of reactions, lots of they've done this, we need to do that. I'm going to play this player because their right back is weak or something. I think he's really good at that. But I guess the bigger picture stuff that managers are really responsible for, like what is our identity? What is our style? What do we do on the days where it's just a 6 out of 10 and we're at home to Everton and maybe we're not amazing, but we win? And like I watched Man City on Sunday at Liverpool, very 5 or 6 out of 10, but Bunny Shaw scores twice and they win 2-1 and they get the hell out of there. Like, I felt like that part was missing, and that's where I remember Joe Montemoro used to say, like, because Joe was the complete opposite. He had the big picture philosophical stuff, but not the minor tactical stuff. And Joe always used to say to us, like, we try to give the players the tools to at least get a 7 out of 10 every week. And then from there, their talent can do something more. And I feel like with Jonas, it was kind of the opposite, and that maybe this guy's like an elite assistant coach or analyst. I thought he was great as a TV pundit on the World Cup. Like, what's, I guess, your 1,000-foot impression of Jonas Eidevall, Arsenal head coach? Because there were some really good times under him as well.
Yeah, I completely agree, Tim. I was going to say that. I think his tactical, the way he sorts out games in minor phases, I think is very impressive. And I think that's why he's so good against the bigger teams, is he can break down, okay, I know a team as good as Man City are going to do this after 15 minutes, and then they might adjust. And he's very good at viewing that. However, like you said, I think the team culture and being able to kind of set the foundations of a football club, which is, in my eyes, just as important, because you need to get the players ticking. He's not as strong at, to say the least. So I think as a backroom stuff, something like an analytical job, I think Jonas would actually be very good at. I just don't know if he's the front man in the way that maybe Arsenal have needed. Well, Arsenal have definitely needed. I think, like you said, as punditry during the World Cup, he's got this eye for the game that often listening to him during the World Cup, I'd say, oh, I didn't actually see that in that way. And that's actually really interesting. And I often got that impression from him during press conferences as well. If he would break down a tactic, I would probably think, oh, that makes so much more sense. Like, I get that now. So I think as a tactics manager, I completely echo what you think, Tim. I think he's very strong in that aspect, and perhaps a lot weaker in the aspect of building the club culture and the foundations of the identity of who Arsenal want to be. And that's where he's really struggled. I think he did very well in the 2022-2023 season on building that kind of culture. However, that did also seem like it was led by the playing group. There was obviously a lot of injuries, and I think the players as well really did well to rally up the morale and the confidence and kind of take the club through that. I'm not saying he wasn't a part of it, because he very much would have been. He's the manager, but I think a lot of that we saw from the players and the leaders, people like Katie McCabe, really shone. I think for me, for Jonas over Arsenal, there's moments in his tenure which have been impressive. Obviously, the back-to-back League Cups is great. It's silverware. Everyone's happy about silverware. However, I think when you manage the WSL compared to maybe the FA Cup of the WSL and the Champions League, as opposed to the League Cup, it's probably the one you want to win the least when you're setting goals for the new season. So it's silverware, but if Arsenal want to return to like this trailblazing force that they are, especially with the quality of the playing list that they have, they can't be settling for League Cup. So I think going forward, it's the right decision. And I'm not saying, I'm going to say there was underperformance across the few seasons. There was silverware, but there was underperformance. And I think for Jonas, he's got the talent for a lot of things in football, but I just don't know if being the front man of a club like Arsenal did work in the way that everyone kind of hoped it would.
Yeah, I think that end of the 22-23 season you allude to, that was crisis management. Effectively, and actually at the last match of that season against Aston Villa, he said in the press conference afterwards, he kind of said, I know I'm good at like crisis management, and actually that's almost what big games are as well. It's almost like it's micromanagement effectively, and yeah, it's that kind of more overall piece. And I think what happens when that kind of happens with a manager is you become a cup manager, because the league is bread and butter, consistency. Can we go and win 1-0 when we're rubbish away at Everton? You know, can we just rely on our talent to get us through some of those games, just like City did on Sunday, as I alluded to? And whereas in like that run to the Champions League semi-final, that for me probably more doesn't end in anything tangible, but probably more impressive than the Conti Cups. But ultimately, Arsenal didn't challenge for the league 2 years in a row, and it's going to be 3 years in a row. Arsenal are not going to challenge for the league this year, and I think this probably is the right outcome. However you feel about the guy, and I understand a lot of fans don't feel too warm and fuzzy towards him. And as we said, I think yesterday, or in past podcasts, the Miedema thing, I think really colours that. Do you have any response to the fact that, and I'm told very firmly that Jonas resigned I suspect that given what he was told over the summer, that the kind of push was probably coming, maybe at the international break. But do you have any sort of response to the fact that it's a resignation and not a sacking, which is the same for Joe Montemurro? Actually, he resigned. He wasn't sacked.
Yeah, I definitely do. I think obviously we don't really know the backroom conversations and how much Arsenal kind of pushed him to make that decision. But if I'm looking from a fan's perspective and you're getting that notification that he's resigned from the position, in my eyes, it does kind of look like Arsenal were dragging their feet a little bit in making that hard decision. And I think that's not very positively reflected on the club because this is a team right now that are struggling. That Bayern Munich loss was horrible. The Everton draw was not good enough, and then obviously another loss to Chelsea has put them out of the league, Tim, like you said. And I think it does show a little bit of complacency from the club. And as a fan looking in on that, it's a little bit like, what were you going to make this hard decision if he were to not kind of make the final call and say I've resigned? And I'm not going to look at this from a Jonas point of view because I can understand why he's resigned. It's not working for either party right now. But I think for the club, it does look like they've kind of been dragging their feet and pondering the decision a little bit, which isn't really a strong reflection in my eyes on the intentions of what Arsenal should be about as a club. It should be this kind of, we are going to drive for success and we're going to make the hard decisions and we're going to have backup plans for the future in place. And to me, Jonas resigning doesn't show like the club were ready to make that hard decision. However, we don't know if they urged him to do so. Hey, Jonas, we're going to put you in a situation where we kind of both know you need to move on. You can have the final word. So, like, I'm fully respectful of the fact that we don't know that backroom conversation, but I think it shows a little bit of complacency in my eyes.
Yeah, and I think ultimately with these things, players will always decide it. And I don't, when I say that, I don't mean that like there was any kind of mutiny or anything like that. But I suspect, and I don't know this at all, I suspect Jonas could see it was done with the players, and that doesn't have to mean that they all hated him, and that there was, that there were like flash points or anything like that, but just when it's done, it's done. I think it was quite clear he'd lost the fan base. I think even before the Miedema thing over the summer, there were a lot of doubts, I think, and I think that really tipped the scales in terms of fan opinion. And I think we said this pre-season, this season has to start well for that conversation to go away, and it hasn't. So I guess, what do you think then about the situation that Arsenal are in, where they've let Vivian Miedema go, and 4 league games into the season they've now let the manager go? Does that? What are your kind of feelings on that?
Yeah, it's not a good look. It's not a good look, and it leaves a sour taste in my mouth, I think. In my eyes, the Viviana Miedema decision, honestly, every club in the world wants Viviana Miedema at their team. I think she is obviously an exceptional footballer. I don't need to explain that to anyone. It's so obvious. In my eyes, when that decision was made, although I was extremely upset as a fan and disappointed in that decision because I love Viv, I think she's an incredible footballer, I kind of had this sense of, if the club are so sure of this decision, maybe they've got an identity going forward. And maybe this is something that they know, that this is a part of the future plan. This is a part of who we are as a club. And this is just going to happen. Sometimes you have to make big sacrifices when you're kind of forging this future. However, in my eyes now looking back, I was probably a little bit naive to think that. And I think it's just a bad situation for the club to be in. There's no real sugarcoating it. It's 4 league games in. The WSL's already out of reach. It's nearly impossible to probably win it at this stage. They've let a striker go to Manchester City, who are your title rivals, for free. She scored against you at the Emirates. It's not a good situation for me, and I think you can always back up your losses through performances, but because those performances haven't followed, I completely empathize with the way that the fans are now saying, well, Jonas didn't like Viv. Viv's gone, Jonas is gone, and we're kind of left questioning. So I can empathize completely with how the fans' heads are kind of muddled. My head's a little bit muddled about that, because if the manager and the backroom staff's intentions were to let her go for the greater plan and that were to pay off, you can kind of say, okay, like, we wish you well. Thank you so much, Viv. But now it's kind of like, well, that's not worked. We've lost Viv. What's next?
Yeah, indeed. And obviously in hindsight, awarding the contract was probably a mistake. I think Jonas's original contract, I think he signed a 1-year deal when he joined, and then very quickly they extended it to make it a 3-year deal, I think, to 2024, which is in keeping with what they usually do. They did exactly the same with Joe Montemurro. I think he signed an initial 1-year deal. Things started very nicely, so they extended. And so his deal was due to be up summer 2024, and in October, Arsenal made the announcement of a 3-year contract. I think it was agreed a little bit before that over the summer, and they chose to announce it at a difficult time, just after Arsenal had lost their first WSL game, gone out of the WCL qualifiers. And I think maybe they're a little bit guilty of template thinking there, because they did the same with Arteta. They they announced a new contract for him off the back of 3 defeats, and they were vindicated in that. But that's Mikel Arteta, and it doesn't mean that approach works for every individual. And certainly in hindsight, and a lot of people will say not in hindsight, because a lot of people didn't agree with it at the time. But a lot of people will say like they should have just, at the very least, just let that deal run down until the summer. And I think, and again, this is speculation, not information, I think they were looking across at Man United with Mark Skinner, Gareth Taylor at Man City. They both seemed to be at the time on sketchy ground. Emma Hayes was about to leave Chelsea, and I think their thinking was, we'll go with stability because everyone else will be changing next summer. Obviously, the two Manchester clubs don't change, and Chelsea have, but ultimately things are a little bit out of reach. I mean, in terms of, we kind of covered this on yesterday's pod, how it's difficult in terms of like identifying a long-term successor, just because the kind of coaching pool is a little less visible in women's football. But I guess there's Casey Stoney and Mark Parsons not currently working. I do believe there is some semblance of a shortlist being drawn up, and maybe communicate some of the names on there once I get more solid information. But do you have any idea where Arsenal go from here? And in terms of what it means for this season as well? Well, actually, no, we covered that yesterday, what it means for this season. Do you have any concerns about like more long-term damage than just this season?
Yeah, I think it's a hard one because Arsenal probably, in their eyes, I can imagine, right now want to appoint a head coach as soon as possible. Renee Slegger's probably, I don't know her intentions with the team, but I imagine they'll be looking as soon as possible for a coach that's out of a job. I think if you were to, this isn't what I'm saying they should do, and I'm not saying that they will do this at all, but if you're looking at a long-term solution and you can get Renee to kind of hold on for the season, there are coaches that become available next summer. I think Elena Sadiku, I think it is, from Celtic. She, in my eyes, is a fantastic manager. One of our writers at the halfway line, Liberty Simons, who we mention a lot, did a bit of a profile on her the other day because she's taken Celtic to obviously new heights. And I think she plays a very exciting attacking brand of football. Mac Lind is another one that I've heard thrown around a lot. He's the BK Häcken manager, but I think he's in contract till 2026. So that I don't see him coming out of that. Häcken are in a pretty solid place right now. So in terms of long-term solutions, I think there are a couple names, but I don't know if Arsenal will be willing to wait, and I don't think that they should because they've got a lot of important football. Regardless of whether they're out of the league, they need Champions League qualification. They want to progress in Europe. So I think a long-term solution probably isn't ideal for Arsenal right now, but I don't really know of anyone that could probably take the job next Monday and say, all right, let's ball out for the rest of the season. But Tim, I'm interested to see what you think. We spoke on it yesterday, but I'm interested to see what you think in regards to this.
Yeah, I would be surprised if there wasn't a permanent appointment made reasonably soon. I guess it just depends on like how gettable their targets actually are. And that, they might end up having to wait for someone. I don't know. When this happened under Pedro Loza, I think it was like 3 or 4 games we had an interim. And of course, Arsenal have got big game off the back of the international break. They go to Manchester United on November the 3rd, and if Arsenal's aspirations now have kind of been downgraded to trying to finish third, Manchester United are likely to be stiff competition for that. And if they lose that game, they're going to be quite adrift of Manchester United, and they're not going to be in a very good position. So I strongly suspect the club will want someone in place by, over the international break. And I would be very surprised if the club haven't seen the writing on the wall here and probably haven't been putting together a bit of a list of targets. Like, I'd be incredibly surprised if, on Monday that process started. I'm sure at least in the background they were having thoughts, and maybe even before that. I don't know. Given the ambitions of the club and everything, and from what I understand, that Jonas was told that there'd need to be an improvement this season. So I'd be very surprised. But at the same time, René Slegers, there's actually some peculiar symmetry here. René Slegers took over from Jonas at Rosengård when he left for Arsenal. So this isn't her first rodeo taking over from Jonas. And I think one of the things that Jonas tried to do, and again, this is kind of speculation, not information on my part, but there's lots of lots of people have speculated on like interpersonal skills of players and all of that. And there's actually a real like logistical thing there for male coaches as well, because they're obviously not allowed in the dressing room for safeguarding reasons and all of that. And Arsenal were bringing like a lot of female coaches into the environment, into the backroom staff. Obviously, Kelly Smith, Lydia Bedford came for a few months, then René Slegers, and she extended her contract over the summer as well. And now you've got Melissa Reid-Clark, nay Mel Phillips, who has head coach experience. So I think there was a mixture of wanting female coaches, again, purely for logistical reasons, so they could be in the dressing room and have more of a link between the coaching staff and the players. And maybe Jonas was recognising a bit of a weakness there in terms of, okay, let's get people on my coaching staff who can provide that really like personal interface. And René Slegers, her duties have been, to this point, on match days, she's in communication with the analysts. So you'll probably see this, Jamie, in the press box. The analysts are usually sat behind you and they're all wearing earpieces, and so is René Slegers, and that's because she is in contact with the analysts on the bench, because they talk about things like what's the halftime team talk going to be like. We need clips of, they'll get like, I don't know, with the time, they'll probably get about 3 clips. So they'll be in communication about that. But René Slegers was also worked with players on an individual basis. So, whack the iPad out, sit with players and kind of go through clips with them. So she had that individual interface with the players anyway. And obviously she has head coach experience. So it could be that if they can't get who they want, like René Slegers has, good head coach experience, as does Mel Reid-Clark as well. So maybe they could go to the end of the season, or maybe they could go to January or whatever. Like maybe they want to coach from a league. You mentioned Max Lind there from Häcken as well. Swedish season ends in November. NWSL ends around the same time. So I don't know, maybe there might be an opportunity to get a coach from one of those leagues, and it might have to wait until then. But I kind of think that at least for now, there'll be a red ring around that Manchester United away game off the back of the international break. But at the moment, I don't know who that's going to be. So, yeah, I mean, I guess kind of exciting times. Why don't we wrap up, Jamie, with why don't we wrap up on a slightly high note? And I'd like you to pick one kind of good memory from Jonas Eidevall's 3 and a bit years in charge of Arsenal. What do you think was the high point of his reign?
I'm going to say the semi-final second leg against Wolfsburg in the Champions League. I remember watching that game. I think it was 3 a.m. in Melbourne, and I had a 7 a.m. uni class. And because it went so long, I was like on the bus watching the last 10 minutes, and then Wolfsburg scored, and it was awful. However, I don't think as someone who is an Arsenal women's fan, I don't think there's been a moment in my life where I've been more proud to be an Arsenal women's fan than I was after that game. And I remember just the sheer character that team showed throughout what was a really, really hard period with injuries, with just everything. And I remember Jonas saying, "I'm so proud of this group." And I was like, I am so proud of this group. And despite the defeat, and there was a Champions League game within touching distance, like a final so close. And you saw Wolfsburg put up a good fight against Barcelona as well. So it's a game of what ifs. But I remember saying I've never been this proud to follow this club, because it's all about fight and it's all about togetherness. And I think that was such a kind of family community moment that everyone felt with the players, with Jonas, with the backroom staff, and just an Arsenal family as well. So I'll say that was mine.
Yeah, I think I felt really positive after that. I thought, I think this team and this club is going places under this coach. And in hindsight, it's just never been the same since then. And actually, so that strikes me as like the peak or the high watermark. I'm going to go, perhaps unsurprisingly, same competition. I'm going to go for the round before that home game against Bayern Munich, where they're 1-0 down from the first leg. They didn't deserve to lose the first leg 1-0, and they just came out like a ball out of a cannon. And when I talked a little bit earlier about perhaps just never quite seeing under Jonas what's our style, what's the style we go and play teams with, no matter what, like irregardless of whether we're inverting the left back this week or playing Stina because it's a high line, like what does Arsenal look like? When I close my eyes, what do I see? I think that's the closest probably Arsenal have got to that. Where they just come out and they're absolutely all over Bayern Munich like a rash. They lose Kim Little to injury early on, doesn't deter them, and they just absolutely smashed through Bayern. And I think if you asked Jonas privately, I suspect he'd rank that very highly in terms of performances, and I suspect he'd probably say that's what I wanted my Arsenal team to look like on a more regular basis. And obviously the Frida Mornham goal that night as well that wins it is one of the best goals I've ever seen with my own eyes, quite frankly. And I've been to, quite a few football matches in my time. So I really take that Bayern game, really. And that, I think, really built the momentum for the Wolfsburg game and the first ever sellout at the Emirates as well. I think people watched that game and really felt there was something to get behind. And there was, and unfortunately it didn't last, but that's football sometimes, I guess. Jamie, unless there's anything else you want to add on this kind of poignant day for Arsenal women, thanks very much. And thanks very much for coming together at short notice.
Thanks, Tim. On to the next one.
Indeed, on to the next one. And press conference with Renee Sleggers in a couple of hours. So hopefully I'll get a question. Not sure. It depends how many people are in the room, because attending virtually today, and that doesn't always guarantee you. And I imagine there'll be a lot of interest now, but there we go. Those are the breaks, and obviously on Arseblog News, if and when we hear anything about about a potential successor, and if we're able to break anything on that, we will. Maybe with more notice than 0.3 seconds ahead of the Arsenal statement. We'll see, but it's all part of the game. And I think probably a lot of us feeling. There are probably some people feeling relieved, some people feeling happy, some people feeling pensive, but certainly a big day. And, I think hopefully some excitement about what the future holds, certainly some curiosity. So we'll be across that for you. But otherwise, if nothing else remarkable happens, Jamie and I will be back with you on Monday after the game at West Ham. Thanks very much, and we'll speak to you then.